Hi everyone. So we are going to begin with the third part of brain functions involved in creativity and problem solving. So I'm going to share my screen. Right. So we've looked at network dominance and subprocesses. So now we are going to look at domain-specific variations. Okay, so cross-field studies highlight how the differences between DMN and ECN manifest practically. Okay, so a 2010 analysis compared health, biological, and social scientists. Health scientists excel in problem definition and implementation. Okay, um, and implementation, which are the strengths of the executive control network. Biological in idea generation and evaluation, which is a balanced form of relation between uh, DMN and ECN, domain mode network and executive control network, and social in information organization, which involves semantic focus. Okay, so it suggests that problem solving in structured domains, example biology, amplifies executive control network for precision, while creative fields like art prioritize domain mode network for novelty. Okay, so neuroscientific reviews in Germany emphasize domain and context variability, with innovation in visual domains recruiting more VOTC, RC than verbal ones. Okay, so if you remember VOTC particularly referred referred to ventral occipito-temporal cortex. Okay, so that is what it referred to, and basically a representational change that we talked about in the previous lecture that actually occurs in the ventral occipito-temporal cortex. Okay, or the VOTC. Okay. So, insights from neuroscience, as I said, indicates that while both use visualization, creativity predicts originality via vividness and problem solving via structured recombination. Okay, so important to take that into account. And now we will look at emotional and novelty driven creativity in science fiction and horror. Okay, so what we are doing, we are basically looking at applications of DMN and ECN. Okay, so Mary Shelley, okay, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein connects creativity to ethical problem solving. Okay, so that is a very important example. With Victor Frankenstein's obsessive innovation driven by limbic motivation and cerebellar novelty seeking. Okay, because he is constantly looking for ways to take advanced science. Okay, which is why he takes up the task of bringing a dead man to life. All right, creating a monster. So yeah, so driven by limbic motivation and cerebellar novelty seeking, leading to disastrous convergence. Okay, so important. The critiques unchecked um, DMN ideation without um, this particular way of working. Okay, critiques unchecked domain mode network ideation without executive control network oversight, referencing learning methods where emotional rewards such as dopamine fuel scientific creativity. Okay, so what it does is that he is actually working obsessively. Okay, in that particular kind of in his um creative as well as scientifically enabled task of bringing a dead person back to life. All right. So it connects creativity to ethical problem solving, but then you find that it kind of leads to a disastrous convergence. Okay. So it kind of, he's unable to like keep his sanity as the novel progresses. So that is important to take into account because of what he has created. Okay. So there is motivation on one hand, uh, and the desire to seek novelty, and both of it combine together to to create an impossible project which he actually makes possible, and then suffers the consequences of that project. So it critiques unchecked DMN ideation um, without executive control network, referencing learning methods where emotional rewards fuel scientific creativity. Okay, again, you find that in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, protagonist Montague's creative rebellion involves parietal sensory integration and PFC self reflection, depicting reading as a brain training method for divergent thinking against conformity. Okay, so that is also important to take note of. Right, so we will just get into the example of Ray Bradbury using reading as a form of brain training and mental exercise. Okay, in um in uh, in Fahrenheit 451. So it has a cautionary depiction in Fahrenheit 451 because Bradbury's most dramatic illustration of reading as brain training appears inversely in Fahrenheit 451. In the dystopia that he presents, books are burned because they provoke uncomfortable thought, deep emotion, and critical reflection, precisely the mental work a conformist society discards. The regime promotes shallow, fast paced media, okay, wall sized TVs and rapid clips that bombard the senses without demanding sustained attention or analysis. Bradbury later clarified the novel critiques not primarily censorship, but the numbing effects of mass media that substitute sensation for thinking. Okay, characters like Montague evolve from mental numbness to awakening through clandestine reading, rediscovering empathy, memory, and intellectual depth. Books become symbols of preserved humanity. They train the mind to question, feel profoundly, and resist manipulation. The absence of reading leads to a dulled, amnesiac populace incapable of complex thought, underscoring Bradbury's belief that regular engagement with literature is essential brain maintenance against intellectual atrophy. Okay, so that is an important example to consider. Okay, reading as a brain training method. Okay, now you have pedagogical references. Actually, we don't need to go into pedagogical references, or maybe we can a little bit. So, children's literature such as Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, um, uses absurd problems to train associative thinking, mirroring temporal lobe creativity. Okay, so that is important to take into account. So, there are absurd things happening in Alice in Wonderland, and it actually enables the reader to develop associative thinking. Okay, so that is important to consider. Um, so, yes. So, for example, associative thinking means jumping across paradigms, connecting one pattern of thought with another, and that is what happens in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Okay, so for example, Carroll's work shows that exposure to, Carroll's work actually deliberately subverts everyday rules of physics, logic, language, and social norms. And in doing that, it actually loosens rigid literal thinking and encourages flexible, creative mental processes. Okay, so important to take note of that. And so, for example, Alice repeatedly shrinks to different sizes, okay, tiny sizes, and also kind of becomes large sometimes after eating a cake or a mushroom. Okay, so the absurdity lies in the fact that normal cause and effect is inverted. Okay, food can't cause such kind of transformations, but because Lewis Carroll introduces that image of Alice shrinking and growing large, it actually brings to your mind, it actually brings, it challenges logic, okay, and it actually brings to your mind certain other impossible, occurrences, all right, whether it be in nature, whether it be in real life. For example, just the very fact of, um, you know, 1 second. Right. So one of the examples would be, the absurdity in Alice's world, kind of giving rise to associative thinking and causing the reader to think about um, advancements in science, advancements in maths that appear illogical or absurd at that time. So Lewis Carroll was a professional mathematician, okay, and logician. So he particularly championed Euclidean geometry. Okay, viewing emerging 19th century developments such as symbolic algebra, projective geometry, etc., as detached from concrete reality and potentially absurd or misleading for teaching. Okay, so the world that he creates in Alice's Wonderland, the reversal of everyday logic actually mirrors the advancements that were occurring in the areas of science and maths, and kind of caused um, a certain um, and gave rise to a certain challenge to the everyday way of viewing the world. So that is actually important to take note of. Okay. Right. So then you also have um, So yeah, so then we will look at problem solving in the very important book Thinking Fast and Slow, which came out in 2011 and is written by Daniel Kahneman. Okay, so we'll go and look at it in detail. So Daniel Kahneman's seminal work Thinking Fast and Slow explores the dual process model of cognition through system one, which is fast, intuitive, and automatic thinking, and system two, which involves slow, deliberate, effortful thinking with profound implications for problem solving. Problem solving is not treated as a standalone topic, but is woven throughout the book as a core aspect of judgment, decision making, and reasoning under certainty. Kahneman draws on decades of research in behavioral economics and psychology to illustrate how intuitive shortcuts or heuristics from system one, okay, which involves fast, intuitive, and automatic thinking, can actually you know uh, can actually lead to systematic errors or biases in solving problems. Okay, but on the other hand, system 2, which involves slow, deliberate, and effortful thinking, it provides analytical tools to correct them, okay, though it is often considered lazy and underutilized. Okay, so the book uses puzzles, experiments, and real world examples to demonstrate these dynamics, emphasizing that effective problem solving requires recognizing biases, engaging deliberate thought, and adopting strategies like statistical reasoning and external perspectives. So we are going to look at it in greater detail. So let us. So he calls it the dual system framework and its role in problem solving. So Kahneman introduces the two systems early on as characters in the mind's story. System one operates effortlessly, generating quick impressions, associations, and intuitive solutions based on resemblance, availability, and what he calls what you see is all there is. Jumping to conclusions from limited data without considering alternatives or uncertainties. He argues that this makes it efficient for routine problems, but prone to errors in complex or novel ones. System 2, on the other hand, in contrast, handles effortful computations, logical analysis, and self control, enabling structured problem solving like multiplication or statistical inference. However, System 2 is energy intensive and often defaults to endorsing System 1's suggestions unless prompted by conflict or motivation. In problem solving, the interplay is central. System 1 provides initial heuristics for efficiency, but biases arise when it substitutes easier questions such as how does this feel or what are the facts. Okay. Kahneman argues that many problem solving failures stem from over reliance on system 1. Okay, leading to illusions of understanding, while improvements come from activating system 2 through deliberate checks, incentives, or environmental cues. For instance, in chapter 1, he notes when faced with a difficult question, we often answer an easier one instead, usually without noticing the substitution. So this substitution heuristic is a recurring theme affecting everything from everyday puzzles to high stakes decisions. Okay, so that is an important, statement made by him with regards to problem solving. And now we will look at the examples that he gives. Okay, so there is the famous bat and ball puzzle. Okay, which is designed to trick your quick intuitive thinking. Okay, so what he is arguing basically is that one there is an over reliance on system one. We kind of intuitively try to understand things, and that actually leads to illusions of understanding. Whereas if we look towards slow, deliberate processing of facts and logical analysis, then we would be able to understand the world better. Okay, so that is what he says. So, for example, let us look at the bat and ball puzzle. Okay, so the puzzle states that a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. Okay, the bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So many people, including a majority of students at top universities, immediately answered 10 cents. But that is actually incorrect. Okay, so he gives the breakdown. Total, if you take it, the total to be $1.10, that costs $1 more than the ball. So it splits into $1.10 roughly, $1 for the bat and 10 cents for the ball. But if you actually think about it and put it in algebraic equation, okay, then you find that it actually costs 5 cents. Okay, that is what, because if you take a look at it, the ball is 10 cents, and then the bat is $1.10. Okay, okay, because the point is the bat is actually $1 more than the ball. Okay, so it is already $1.10. The bat's price is already $1.10. Okay, because I hope you understand, like the bat is $1 more than the ball, so the ball is 0.10 10 cents, and the bat is $1.10, which makes it $1, $1.10. So if you add 10 cents for the ball and $1.10 for the bat, then it comes to $1.20, which is 10 cents too much. So he actually breaks it down and says that the ball is actually 5 cents, which is the accurate answer. Okay, so now we will look at the other ways in which he kind of divides his arguments. So, chapter 2 focuses on attention and effort. Okay, so he argues effortful problem solving, example, mental multiplication, okay, engages slow, deliberate thinking, dilating pupils as a sign of strain. System 1 handles familiar tasks effortlessly, but overload leads to biases like change blindness. The availability heuristic is introduced, estimating frequency by recall ease. Okay. Distorting risk assessments in problem solving. So, again, very significant. System 1 handles familiar tasks, but overload leads to biases. Okay, so you're unable to process a situation correctly because you have an overload of tasks that you're doing, so that leads to uh problems in cognition and problems in responding to the tasks at hand. So what is necessary is to estimate frequency by recall is distorting risk assessments in problem solving. Next, you have chapter 3, which looks at the lazy controller. Okay, so system two's laziness is a major barrier. Okay, the argument is that it is lazy because it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of deliberation going into it. So it endorses system one without verification unless motivated. The cognitive reflection test measures it, including the bat and ball, widget machines. Okay, 5 machines make 5 widgets in 5 minutes, etc. 100 machines take 5 minutes, not 100. Okay, so those are the examples that he gives. Okay, so that is the lazy controller issue that he talks of. Next, you have heuristics and biases. Okay, systematic errors in problem solving. So here, Kahneman delves into specific heuristics that simplify problem solving but introduce biases using puzzles to show how system one overrides logic. Okay. So, for example, he talks about the law of small numbers. Okay, system one over extrapolates from small samples, violating statistical principles. Okay, for example, assuming 4 marbles are more homogeneous than 7. Okay, this leads to over precision in research or predictions where professionals overestimate from limited data. System 2 must apply statistical thinking, but it often differs. Next, you have chapter 11, which involves anchors. So, anchoring heuristic biases estimates towards initial values. Even arbitrary anchors affect problem solving, like sentencing. System 2 adjusts insufficiently. Improvements include self-generated anchors or extreme values to counter. Okay, so now let us look at what he gives with regards to availability and risk. So availability heuristic solves problems by recall ease. Okay, overestimating vivid events. Okay, for example, terrorism over strokes. Okay, so you are able to kind of recall terrorism, okay, over experiencing strokes. All right, emotional affect biases risk judgments. Example: liking a technology downplays dangers. Okay, availability cascades and amplify public fears, distorting policy problem solving. Okay, so important to take all of it into account. Um, uh, and then he says that representativeness ignores base rates in predictive problems. All right, so that is another kind of an example, but we will not go into it right now. Next, overconfidence. Okay, so illusions in expert and planning problem solving. So, overconfidence stems from System 1's coherent narratives leading to illusions of validity, okay, and planning fallacy. Expert intuition works in regular environments without feedback but fails in unpredictable ones. So, what are the improvements that he suggests? Well, one of them is outside view, okay, um, and then anticipating what can go wrong, okay, all of that. Next, you have part 4, which involves the study of choices. So, what are the biases in decision problem solving? So he argues that there's a particular kind of theory called prospect theory, which reframes problem solving around losses and gains. Okay, so risk averse for gains, seeking for losses. All right, so it has a fourfold pattern, which I'm not going to go into right now. I'm just mentioning it on the surface. And then finally, you have the two selves, okay, memory and experience, and how they are involved in problem solving. And this is the most significant aspect for your, syllabus. So, experiencing versus remembering selves affect utility problem solving. Peak end rule, judged by extremes end, neglects duration. Okay, for example, prefer longer pain if ends are milder. Biases like duration neglect distort evaluations again. Okay, so you have to kind of take into account what is the duration of the problem that you are facing. Okay, so important. And then he argues that day reconstruction method should also be, taken into account. Okay. So let us look at the conclusions that we can draw from Daniel Kahneman's work. So Kahneman concludes that problem solving improves by activating system 2, or the slow and deliberate form of thinking, through vocabulary for biases, okay, such as anchoring and all of that, checklists and organizational tools like pre-mortems, okay. He advocates recognizing that when system one's heuristics fail, and using data-driven approaches. Overall, the book portrays problem solving as a battle against intuitive errors. Okay, with system 2 as the key to rationality, though human laziness limits it. So the framework has influenced fields from policy to personal development, urging deliberate practice to enhance cognitive accuracy. Okay, so that is going to be our discussion on brain functions in creativity and problem solving. So just to quickly, revise, what are the things that we have learned? We have looked at, the parts of the brain involved in default mode network problem solving and executive control network problem solving. Then we have looked at which parts of the brain are actually, responsible for all of these functions, and how there are certain overlaps between DMN and executive control network. Okay, so we have looked at the overlaps between them. Okay, we've also gone through several diagrams. We don't need all of that, but it's good to know which region of the brain is actually responsible for which kind of memory processing. Okay, so we have looked at hippocampus and temporal lobes and what is their function in memory retrieval and emotional processing. We have also looked at cerebellum and its functions as well. So this actually ties up with what we were discussing in your very first lecture on memory and learning. Okay, because there too we had looked at you know different parts of the brain involved in different thinking processes, so that is important. um, Next you have we went into what is the role of the different parts of the brain and how do they help us retain facts. And then we went to a study of the creativity involved in problem solving. Okay, so we were looking at the overlaps between DMN and executive control network. We had quite a few students coming, but unfortunately, we weren't able to let them into the meeting. Okay, but I guess there were a significant amount. It was because it was, we couldn't leave it open for everyone to join at that time. Um, right. So I guess we can look at what were the shared mechanisms. So both require DMN-driven convergent thinking. Okay. Yeah, like we were talking. And then DMN, we looked at how it is responsible for divergent thinking, and executive control network is responsible for convergent thinking. And then we also looked at examples of divergent thinking and um, convergent thinking. So that is important as well to take note of. Yeah, and then we looked at how there are overlaps between DMN and executive control action, and one doesn't seem to take into consideration, but as in one does, I suppose, the fact that there are overlaps. But it's important to focus on all of it. Okay, it's not just DMN and ECN. We are also looking at different kinds of emotional tagging and memory consolidation that is or should have happened immediately after the passing of my grandmother, but that is not what happened. Okay, so I am having that speech thing. Yeah. Anyway, I'm really glad that we got the chance to, discuss all of it, and I'm grateful that all of you listened, and I will, create another lecture on a different topic later. So thank you so much.